He was erased from existence by a bluff he didn't believe. His disappearance wasn't the result of a gang war, but a silent and brutal lesson. This is the story of how Sal Moretti tested Bumpy Johnson and paid the price. The night of November 12, 1948, fell upon Harlem like a velvet shroud, thick and full of secrets. In the basement of a jazz club on 125th Street, a place known as the Foxhole, the air was heavy with the smell of cheap whiskey and cigarette smoke, but an older, more dangerous tension hung in the air. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, the undisputed king of Harlem's underworld, sat before Big Sal Moretti, a Genovese crime family captain sent to renegotiate the boundaries of power. Moretti, a man built with the brutality of Sicily and the arrogance of New York, believed Bumpy's reputation was inflated, a local myth who would bow to the superior force of the Italian Mafia. He came with an offer that was in fact a disguised order, hoping Bumpy would back down before the implicit threat of all-out war. Moretti's mistake was not only underestimating the man in front of him, but failing to understand that, for Bumpy Johnson, Harlem was not territory to be conquered. It was a kingdom to be protected, and certain insults demanded a response that money could not buy. Post-war Harlem was a melting pot of hope and despair, a city within a city pulsing with the energy of black culture, yet shackled by segregation and systemic poverty. For many, the formal economy was a closed door, and survival depended on a parallel economy, an underworld governed by its own laws and its own kings. The numbers game, or policy racket, was the lifeblood of this economy, an illegal lottery system that generated millions of dollars and offered a glimmer of hope to its players. It was an empire built on the pennies of the poor, and whoever controlled it effectively controlled the financial pulse of Harlem. Before Bumpy Johnson, this power was fragmented, contested by small bosses and gangs. The arrival of mobsters like Dutch Schultz and later the Five Families represented an attempt at colonization, an external invasion that viewed Harlem not as a community, but as a source of revenue to be exploited by force, threatening the power structure that, although illegal, maintained a certain order and returned some of the wealth to the community itself. In this scenario of imminent conflict, the figure of Bumpy Johnson emerged not only as a gangster, but as a strategist and a protector. Unlike his rivals, whose authority was based solely on violence and fear, Bumpy cultivated a much more complex and lasting form of power. His reputation was multifaceted. To the people of Harlem, he was a benefactor, a man who paid rents, distributed turkeys on Thanksgiving, and ensured the streets were safe for families. To his competitors, he was a dangerous intellectual, a reader of philosophy and a chess master who applied the principles of strategy to every move on the chessboard of crime. Bumpy understood that true loyalty could not be bought or forced. It needed to be earned through respect, intelligence, and, when necessary, a calculated and decisive show of force. He was not a street thug. He was a statesman of the underworld, with a clear vision to unify Harlem's operations under one banner, ensuring that the wealth generated in the community remained in the community. Bumpy Johnson's moral code was paradoxical, yet unwavering. He operated in a world of lawlessness, but his word was his bond, a contract stronger than any signed document. If Bumpy said a man was safe, he was safe. If he promised retribution, retribution was certain. This predictability in a chaotic world was the foundation of his authority. He despised unnecessary violence and chaos, seeing them as amateurish tools. Violence, for Bumpy, was a surgical instrument, to be used with precision to remove a threat and restore balance. He saw himself as a necessary evil, a guardian keeping even worse predators at bay. This philosophy put him in direct conflict with the Mafia's approach, which saw brutality as a first, not a last option. Bumpy believed in order, and the encroachment of outsiders who didn't respect Harlem's unwritten rules was the greatest threat to that order, a threat he was prepared to confront at any cost to protect his people and his domain. The construction of his psychological persona was forged in the toughest prisons of New York, where he survived not through brute force, but through intelligence and the ability to read people. He learned that respect was a more valuable currency than fear, and that patience was the greatest weapon. When he returned to Harlem, He applied these lessons masterfully. He didn't need to shout to be heard. His whisper carried more weight than the screams of other men. Bumpy was a master of restraint. His calmness in high-pressure situations was disconcerting to his enemies. They mistook his controlled behavior for weakness, his willingness to negotiate for fear. It was a fundamental miscalculation, a failure to realize that behind the diplomatic facade was a mind that was always several moves ahead, anticipating betrayals, planning contingencies, and patiently waiting for the perfect moment to strike. This ability to mask his lethality under a layer of civility was his greatest strategic advantage and the most subtle trap he could set. The complexity of Bumpy Johnson lay in his duality. He was a man who could discuss poetry as easily as he ordered the execution of a rival. He was a devoted husband and father who ruled a criminal empire. This complexity made him unpredictable and fascinating. He wasn't a one-dimensional monster. He was a product of his time and circumstances, a man who used his mind and strength to carve out a kingdom in a world that offered him few opportunities. He represented Harlem's struggle for self-determination, a struggle fought in the shadows with the only tools available. The reputation he built was armor, forged with acts of generosity and moments of calculated cruelty. Each story, each legend, added a new layer to that armor, until the man and the myth became indistinguishable. Sal Moretti wasn't just facing a man. He was facing the weight of a decade of stories, the power of a community, and the indomitable will of a king who considered Harlem an extension of his own body. Sal Moretti's fatal mistake was arrogance, a common disease among men who confuse power with invincibility. Sitting in the stuffy basement, he looked at Bumpy Johnson and saw only a minor obstacle, a local gang leader whose time was up. He made his offer. Bumpy's organization would become a subsidiary of the Genovese family, handing over 70% of the profits in exchange for protection. The word protection hung in the air, laden with threat. Moretti smiled, a disdainful gesture that revealed his gold teeth. "It's this or war, Bumpy, and you don't want a war with us. We are the ocean. You're just a puddle." That sentence, spoken with the certainty of a man who had never known defeat, sealed his fate. He completely underestimated the depth of Bumpy's pride and his connection to Harlem. He didn't realize that for Bumpy, relinquishing control wasn't a business option. It was a betrayal of everything he stood for. Bumpy's refusal was silent, a slight shake of the head that Moretti, in his arrogance, interpreted as a desperate bluff. The trap was set with watchmaker precision. The jazz club wasn't neutral territory. It belonged to a childhood friend of Bumpy's, and every waiter, every musician, every person in the room was loyal to him. When Moretti arrived with only 2 bodyguards, confident in his own reputation to guarantee his safety, he had already lost. The basement room, chosen for its sound-muffling acoustics, had only one entrance, now discreetly blocked by one of Bumpy's men disguised as security. The atmosphere, which had previously seemed merely intimate and private, suddenly became claustrophobic. The tension was palpable. Bumpy remained calm, his face an impenetrable mask, and let Moretti speak, allowing the man's arrogance to completely blind him to the reality of the situation. Each word of disdain, each gesture of superiority, was another turn of the key that locked his own tomb. The irreversibility of the moment set in when Bumpy finally spoke, his voice low and controlled, but sharp as broken glass. "You come to my house," Bumpy began, "disrespect my people and my intelligence, and expect me to thank you for it." Moretti laughed, a loud, forced laugh. "Your house? This is New York, Bumpy, and New York is ours." He leaned forward, his smile fading. "I'll say it one last time. Accept the deal." Bumpy didn't answer immediately. He picked up a glass of whiskey, swirling the amber liquid slowly, his eyes never leaving Moretti's. The silence stretched, heavy and menacing. Moretti's bodyguards began to grow nervous, their eyes scanning the shadows of the small room. They sensed the change in the atmosphere before their boss noticed it. Moretti's confidence began to waver, replaced by a spark of uncertainty. He had arrived expecting a swift capitulation, but he encountered a cold, silent resistance he couldn't decipher. The confrontation was no longer about numbers. It became a test of willpower, and Moretti's was beginning to crumble. Underestimation was at the heart of the mistake. Moretti, like so many others before and after him, saw Bumpy's skin color before he saw the man. He saw him through the lens of prejudice, assuming that a black criminal, however successful in his own enclave, couldn't compete in intelligence or strategy with the old, established Italian Mafia. He hadn't done his homework. He didn't understand that Bumpy had waged a bloody war against Dutch Schultz, and won not through brute force, but through a brilliant guerrilla campaign and strategic alliances. He didn't know that Bumpy read Machiavelli and Sun Tzu, applying their lessons to the streets of Harlem. To Moretti, Bumpy was just a lucky black man. This simplistic and racist worldview prevented him from seeing the complexity of the trap he was willingly walking into, failing to conceive of a scenario in which he wasn't in control. The enclosed environment of the basement amplified every detail. The sound of ice clinking in Bumpy's glass, the increasingly heavy breathing of one of Moretti's bodyguards. Each sound was a nail in the coffin of Moretti's confidence. Bumpy had created a theater of psychological tension, a space where physical strength was useless and external reputation meant nothing. Only the dynamics within that room mattered. Bumpy's men, positioned in the shadows, were invisible until the moment they needed to become visible. The trap wasn't just physical with a locked door, it was psychological. Bumpy stripped Moretti of his usual advantages, numbers, firepower, and the element of surprise, and forced him to play on a chessboard where Bumpy set all the rules. Moretti's arrogance prevented him from realizing that the invitation to the meeting wasn't a negotiation, but a summons to his own judgment. The turning point was as silent as it was absolute. When Sal Moretti's bodyguards, finally realizing the trap, tried to draw their weapons, they discovered they were already disarmed. Bumpy's men had moved with almost supernatural speed and stealth, relieving them of their pistols, without them even noticing. Bumpy's control over the situation was total. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make a sudden move. He simply observed, his face as calm as the surface of a lake before a storm. "I believe this negotiation is over," Bumpy said, his voice cutting through the tense silence. The expression on Moretti's face shifted from shock to fury, and finally to abject fear. He tried to argue, to bargain, to threaten with the wrath of the Genovese family, but his words sounded empty and pathetic. He was no longer a mafia captain. He was just a man, powerless, and at the mercy of someone he had despised. The direct consequence of Moretti's mistake was swift and brutal, but it wasn't a spectacle of gratuitous violence. It was a clean, professional execution. Bumpy nodded to Junie Bird, and that was all. Moretti and his men were led to a back room. There were no screams, just the muffled sound of a brief struggle and then silence. The message was clear. Bumpy Johnson's strength lay not in chaos, but in lethal efficiency. The symbolic consequence was even more powerful. By eliminating a Genovese captain so cleanly and undeniably within his own territory, Bumpy sent a shockwave throughout the New York underworld. He demonstrated that Harlem was not a prize to be taken, but a sovereign fortress. He proved that his calmness was not weakness, and that his words were not bluffs. The lesson was etched into the city's criminal folklore. Don't underestimate the King of Harlem. The final message that cemented Bumpy's untouchability was silence itself. In the days following Sal Moretti's disappearance, Bumpy made no statement. He simply continued his business as usual, visiting his tenants and playing chess in the park. This silence was more deafening than any threat. It was the silence of a power so absolute that it needed no self-affirmation. The message was clear. The matter was closed. Order had been restored. Weeks later, an anonymous gift arrived at the Genovese family headquarters, an expensive chessboard with only one piece missing, the White King. There was no note. There didn't need to be. It was a message of power, intelligence, and dominance. It meant that he had not only won the game, he had permanently removed his opponent's king from the board. This audacious and poetic gesture perfectly encapsulated Bumpy Johnson's personality. The historical impact of that event was profound. It marked the beginning of an era of relative autonomy for the Harlem underworld. The Mafia families, instead of attempting a hostile takeover, were forced to form an uneasy alliance with Bumpy Johnson, treating him as a business partner. This piece of Harlem allowed Bumpy to further strengthen his empire, expanding his operations and his philanthropic work. He became an even more legendary figure, a Black Robin Hood who confronted the White Mafia and won on his own terms. The story of how he dealt with Sal Moretti became part of the cultural fabric of Harlem, an example of black resistance against external oppression, even if that resistance came from a criminal source, solidifying the idea that Harlem was self-governing, with Bumpy as its uncrowned sovereign. Bumpy's story is a reminder that power takes many forms, and the most important battles are often won before they even begin, through strategy and an understanding of human nature. Sal Moretti saw a game of checkers, simple and straightforward. Bumpy Johnson was playing three-dimensional chess. The legacy of this confrontation lies not in the violence, but in the lesson it taught. Blind arrogance and underestimating an opponent based on prejudice is the most fatal mistake of all. Bumpy's influence would extend for decades, shaping the balance of power in New York's underworld and leaving an indelible mark on Harlem's history. If you are fascinated by minds that bend the world to their will, this is just one of the lessons he taught. Stay tuned for more.